It's Wednesday, the 28th of September. This is Politics Live on the final day of the Labour Party conference in Liverpool. Joining me today, the political editor of the Liverpool Echo, Liam Thorpe, GB News political correspondent Tom Harwood, and Shadow Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson. Today, the International Monetary Fund tells the government to rethink their tax cuts. Here in Liverpool, the Labour leader goes on the attack.
This, unlike other fluctuations in the market, is a self-inflicted wound.
I don't think the British government should say anything to the IMF. I don't think we want a spat or a dialogue between the British government and the IMF.
Now the Bank of England say they'll buy UK government debt to stave off a material risk to UK financial stability.
Millions of green jobs with Labour.
A fairer, greener, more dynamic nation.
A fairer, greener future. That is what we can deliver.
That message has gone down well in the conference hall this week. Will it resonate with voters? Let's start with those dramatic interventions on the economy in the UK, because last night the International Monetary Fund, the global lender of last resort, came in and said this. If we look at the headline here in the Daily Telegraph, reverse tax cuts announced by the Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng last Friday, IMF tells Truss. There's also been an intervention from the Bank of England. That's happened just in the last hour or so. You can see this tweet from BBC Breaking News. Bank of England steps in to calm markets by buying UK government bonds. We're going to speak to both Stephanie Flanders, Senior Executive Editor of Bloomberg, and Vicky Young, the BBC's Deputy Political Editor. I'm going to start with you, Stephanie Flanders. What do you make of both those interventions?
Well, obviously, the International Monetary Fund, long history of talking about conservative plans, usually a bit more positively. I think it was very striking that they decided to make that statement last night because it just showed how far at odds the government's announcements on Friday were with what most economists and certainly the International Monetary Fund think is a kind of a sensible approach to what is a very difficult situation for all governments. All governments are facing this situation where you've got inflation, you're going to have to raise interest rates to bring inflation down, but at the same time you have households really suffering. So the issue has been, how do you spend money supporting households without making the Bank of England's job even harder by pushing too much money into the economy? Lots of governments struggling with that. Lots of governments struggling with the idea that interest rates over the long term are going to be more expensive, so all that debt they have is going to be more expensive. I think the problem for the UK was that the way the announcement came out, the decision to also have just a broad tax cut for the highest earners just sent a signal that they weren't really concerned about the trade-offs and certainly not concerned about how much money it was going to cost. So that is what concerned the International Monetary Fund and the investors who've been selling off the pound and government debt.
And what about the Bank of England's intervention just in the last hour or so, that they themselves, in order to restore, in their own words, market stability in the UK, are going to be buying up government debt?
Yeah, and this is, it's difficult to understand, but it's actually the most important thing that's happened in the last few days. There's what's happened to the government bond market. We woke up on Monday morning very focused on, pound all-time low. Would it go to parity with the dollar, $1 for £1? The real story hiding in plain view and the real risk to the economy and the financial system was in this big sell-off in government debt. So that means, gilts are worth much less and the government's spending a lot more to borrow. Now, the spending a lot more to borrow means we're facing higher mortgage rates down the road, potentially squeezing the economy harder, having a housing market crash, potentially. But right now, it also means all these gilts, all these bonds sitting on the balance sheets of financial institutions, sitting in most people's pension savings, are all worth a third of what have fallen by a third since the start of the year. There's been just in the last few days, the value of those bonds has fallen dramatically. And what the Bank of England had decided, its financial policy arm, so they're very clear, they're saying this isn't monetary policy, this isn't interest rates, this is their financial stability arm saying this poses a risk to financial institutions. They've got all of these bonds sitting on their balance sheets, which are worth so much less than they were even a few days ago. They might find themselves having to sell quickly to meet their obligations in terms of liquidity, in terms of their overall financial solvency, which could cause, a serious financial crisis. So this is the Bank of England saying we are at risk of a financial crisis if the government bond market doesn't start to stabilise. And it has in response to that statement.
Well, Stephanie Flanders, thank you very much. Vicky Young, just to pick up on that point, the political reaction, government reaction, particularly to the Bank of England having to issue a statement a short while ago to say that we're coming in, we're intervening in order to prevent a financial crisis. What's been their reaction?
Well, if you look at since Friday what's happened, basically that so-called mini budget has unleashed a chain of events which it appears the Chancellor and the Prime Minister hadn't foreseen. And I think that is what's alarming Tory MPs the most, really. Some calling it political ineptitude, naivety, that they should have seen this coming, and why didn't they? Now, they would also say that, look, there was a huge clamour, wasn't there, for help over energy bills. And remember, most of that package that was announced is to help people, every household and businesses, with those enormous energy costs. And there weren't many people, including on the Labour side, who were arguing against that. So it's the other things on top of that which seem to have spooked the markets. And I think that's where Tory MPs are saying the Chancellor particularly should have seen that coming. Why, for example, decide to slash that 45p rate when no one was really asking for that? It was unnecessary. And when he talked to the Chancellor about, conservative economics, that isn't just about growth, which is what the government's hoping to achieve by all of this. It also is about fiscal responsibility, and that bit was completely missing on Friday. And that really seems to be what's happened here. It started that chain of events, which has now, as you say, ended up with the Bank of England having to intervene in one way, and everyone expecting them to have to intervene again with an interest rate rise at some point, and a pretty hefty one at that. And the other concern amongst MPs, Tory MPs, is that actually everyone thought interest rates would have to go up anyway. They'll now have to go up probably further, but also the government will be specifically blamed for that. And that is not a good place for the government to be in.
Well, talking about being blamed for it, we're at the end of the Labour Party conference. In fact, they're all dismantling behind me as we sit here in Liverpool at the end of a week where they feel quite buoyant. Going into the Conservative Party conference next week, what sort of reaction is Kwasi Kwarteng going to get, the Chancellor, when he addresses Conservative MPs?
Well, we always don't we, about conference speeches and sometimes how they can be very important or not. Well, this will be one, and it will be one for the Prime Minister as well when she gives hers, because we haven't really heard from her at all. It is the Chancellor who is under a huge amount of pressure. I suppose the question for next week, there's the external forces, aren't there? There's the reaction from not just opposition parties, but the markets, the rest of the world, it seems, as to what's going on. And then there's the internal party politics as well. And I think there is, bewilderment really amongst a lot of Conservative MPs. How much they speak out about it is another matter. Some are saying, look, we've got to be sensible here. The growth plan, which is what that was, is going to take a long time. You can't judge it over 3 weeks. Some have told me they think that the markets have slightly overreacted with what they've done. They're hoping now, of course, that the Bank of England's intervention will calm things down a bit. But really, November the 23rd, when the Chancellor says he's going to lay out his plans, where he's going to talk much more about how he's going to make the numbers all add up, that seems a very long way off, and getting to that point and keeping things stable could be tricky. Someone else, though, said to me, look, this talk of letters going in and votes of no confidence, getting rid of the Prime Minister, that is idiotic, one person said. But they are going to have to think very carefully about the politics of all of this. And reminding Liz Truss that actually, remember that first round, it seems a long time ago, the first round in the leadership battle, she only had 50 MPs supporting her. So she doesn't have the political backing. She's going to be hoping, though, that her MPs get behind her next week.
Vicky Young, thank you very much for joining us. And of course, we'll bring you that speech live on Monday on a Politics Live special on BBC Two, and that'll be from 4:30. Let's talk to my other guest, Tom Harwood, starting with you. Just how serious is this in terms of reputation to the Conservative Party, this Bank of England intervention?
It's significant in terms of reputation, but it's recoverable. It's clear that there is a great degree of consternation around what has happened. It's clear that some international institutions really don't like...
I'm so sorry, I'm going to just interrupt you because I think we're having a slight problem with your microphone, so somebody might come and fix that. So I'm going to talk to Bridget while they do that. Listening to all of that, Tom was obviously going to outline that it is recoverable. Stephanie Flanders said herself, now the Bank of England has intervened in its capacity as a sort of stabilising force on the financial side. We can carry on.
Well, the government should change course. There was no need for that extraordinary, irresponsible budget that saw big tax cuts handed out to the very wealthiest in our society, at a point at which we appreciate the pressures that everyone is under. I mean, what on earth makes them think that a priority for a tax cut should be the wealthiest 1%? And we see the direct consequence of that reckless and cavalier approach takes us to the instability that we see in the markets right across our economy. But that's not just abstract, this is real people's lives. It will be how much they pay on their mortgage, and it will be the cost to businesses too.
Well, you're expressing some outrage listening to what you've heard so far, but Keir Starmer told the BBC this morning that people with mortgages, as you say, will be a little bit angry that the government has lost control of the economy. I mean, isn't that just putting it a little bit mildly?
No, I think people will be worried. But there is, of course, the government could do things differently. They could have made different choices. The question around all of this, where it comes to the support the government has set out on energy bills, who's paying for that? It's working people across Britain who are going to pay for it, and it's those kinds of decisions that have caused the instability that we're seeing because it's so reckless. We can all see it's reckless, and yet still the government, for reasons best known to themselves, have decided to do that. And it's not the growth we need, because the growth we need will come from working people,
well, you've outlined
not from the top down.
Exactly the scenario, Bridget Phillipson, that I have been putting to some of your colleagues this week. You say it's reckless, and yet you agree with quite a few of the measures. Of course, not the 45p removal at the top end of the tax-paying bracket, but you do agree with the other things. And in terms of borrowing, Labour would be borrowing similar amounts. We can show this graph exactly on the sort of forecast from the Institute of Fiscal Studies about the sorts of borrowing levels. £190 billion is what they're forecasting. But look, in future years, it's still around £100 billion. There is nothing that you can say that could guarantee the markets wouldn't be spooked by your plans at those sorts of levels of borrowing.
The difference where it comes to borrowing between Labour's approach and the Conservatives' approach is we would not be borrowing to give tax cuts to the wealthiest. We would not be borrowing for that short-term fix. We will borrow when it's in the long-term interest of the country, when it's about the change that we need to see in the shape of our...
But you would be borrowing those sorts of amounts, even if, as you say, it may not be for the top 1%. You would still be making tax cuts. You would still be pledging to spend £28 billion a year on your climate change policies. You would be borrowing that amount of money that the market doesn't seem to think is sustainable.
Markets want security and want a long-term plan from a government. Our plan around climate change is a long-term plan that will create jobs in every corner of our country. But everything that we've set out this week is fully costed. If we're going to grow our economy, for example, we need to make sure that we're backing parents. So what I was saying today on the floor of Party Conference was that we should have breakfast clubs for every primary school child in England. That will be paid for by making sure we don't have that tax cut for the wealthiest. So a clear plan behind everything that we are setting out. But yes, governments do make long-term decisions around how you borrow to invest in the country's prosperity, and you've got to have a plan for growth alongside that. We've got a reckless approach in the short term and a plan for growth that will not deliver what working people need.
Well, there are two things there. Your breakfast clubs that you have outlined. So again, you're going to use money to spend on things that you think are a priority, not to bring down borrowing or to reduce the deficit. That's right.
Because it will support parents back into work, and when they're in work, when they're working more hours, when they're able to take up jobs, particularly mothers, they were making a contribution to the economy through our taxation system. And it's the right thing to do.
What about being more radical? You talk about breakfast clubs, laudable, and they will be very, very welcomed by parents across the country. But what about per pupil premium spending in schools? It's flatlined since 2010. Is breakfast clubs the limit of your sort of ambition when it comes to education?
No, absolutely not. So where it comes to childcare, I set out today a Labour's plan for a modern childcare system that will support parents from the end of parental leave right through to the end of primary school and the first step along that journey. But I'm not going to make commitments where I can't demonstrate exactly how that's going to happen with a plan to make it happen. That's the credibility you get from Labour, not this nonsense from the Conservatives around the recklessness.
But is that why Keir Starmer clearly said yesterday, he was candid about it, we may not be able to do certain things, Labour things, good things, he said, very quickly, and your policies will be included in that?
Politics is all about priorities, and it sometimes involves difficult choices. And the state of the public finances, we don't know how difficult things will have got to in 2 years' time.
Let's go back to you, Tom.
I'd just really like to bring in some numbers here, because it's really, really important to look at the scale of what we're talking about. The government has promised energy bill help that could range between 60 to 150 billion pounds of spending, depending on where the price sits. The top rate of tax cut is 2 billion pounds. Now, which is more likely to shift markets? Something that could be 150 billion pounds or 2 billion pounds? I think we really need to get a sense of perspective here in terms of where.
On the oil and gas companies.
So the windfall tax, as Labour has calculated, would raise £8 billion. That's nowhere near £150 billion of spending. Equally, there is already a windfall tax on those oil and gas profits. The difference is about £3 billion, because we're expecting £5 billion to be raised from the windfall tax as it was instituted by Rishi Sunak. All Labour is doing is backdating it slightly and removing the very investment allowances that will generate more electricity.
So why the intervention then necessary by the International Monetary Fund? Why have the markets behaved in the way that they have, if, as you say, the numbers speak for themselves when it comes to that energy intervention? Clearly not.
Well, clearly the markets did not like the mini-budget because it is a break with orthodoxy. It's a change. And the way that things are structured right now, the way that international organisations are structured, are liking the status quo. That's what they're built around. Now we're shifting from the status quo, and that is obviously going to spook some people. And particularly,
It's
I think,
not just
the
some
way
people, is it?
I think
we're talking about the markets, and they haven't been reassured since Friday.
And it's interesting because most of the spending that has now been criticised was announced well before the budget on Friday, or the mini-budget, as I suppose we should call it. It was only an extra handful of billion that was added to that in these surprise tax cuts, because everything else was okay. Firstly, there are some moves in Asian markets today.
Nowhere has had the scale of what's gone on.
But secondly, I think there has been a communication problem with this government. I think it was a mistake to not have the OBR produce an independent assessment alongside it.
And that's the Office of Budget Responsibility, so there were no forecasts, there was no scrutiny.
That's why they didn't want the OBR involved.
Because it's very important to remember that the UK's debt to GDP ratio is the second lowest in the G7. Now, having an authoritative, independent expert body say that might well have been a calming influence on this. But clearly, I think there is a reasonable case to make that this is a bit of an overreaction.
Liam?
I think Tom's doing a valiant effort here, but we cannot in any way underestimate what's gone on here. The Bank of England is stepping in, we're 20 days into a new government, and half of that time the government was enacted because the country was in mourning. It's utterly staggering what the chaos they've managed to inflict upon the country in such a short space of time. The IMF does not rebuke countries; it just doesn't want to do that. It's become a global embarrassment already, this government. And what really sort of annoys me is that we were heading into a cost of living crisis. Well, we already are in it, into the winter. Everything should have been geared towards helping those people who are suffering massively, who are now, on top of this reckless ideology, basically, are going to be looking at huge interest rates on their mortgages next year. They're already struggling to pay for heating and food. It's the people who I speak to in Liverpool, pensioners going to bed at 6 p.m. because they can't put the heating on. Now what are they looking at? And it's all self-inflicted.
What about this push-pull? Because Liam set out, the intervention on energy is substantial. You said yourself. But if the cost of living is going to go up at the same time, so the tax cuts will bring money back to people and interest rates then go up on people's mortgages, how does that make sense if you are looking at it as a homeowner?
Well, firstly, let's look at what the IMF said
in their statement, which was about criticising untargeted measures. Now, that didn't specify specifically which untargeted measures, but clearly the largest untargeted measure is the energy price freeze. Now, they say that the government should reassess the untargeted measures it makes, and potentially that means that the markets would be more happy with an intervention that helps the poorest and not freezing the prices of people on six-figure salaries. But unfortunately, there is not a difference in any party in terms of that big untargeted measure worth over £100 billion.
There's no way on earth you would be sat there saying that if it was a Labour government that was getting that kind of verdict from the IMF and had seen the pound crashing. There is no way you would be sat there saying that.
I'm saying exactly that. I am criticising a big, broad, untargeted intervention that this government has made and that the Labour Party proposed, because it is not targeted, it is not helping just those who very much need the help. It's giving cheaper energy to people on six-figure salaries. How is that justifiable?
Well, how is it justifiable? Because actually colleagues of yours have said it should have been more targeted. Actually, Conservative MPs said to me it should have been more targeted. Why is everybody going to get a reduction in their energy bills when there are some people who can more than afford to pay for it?
It does involve a targeted element, but we know that lots of people, including those who would regard themselves as not people who would otherwise be struggling, would otherwise face a crippling winter if we didn't see a big intervention around it. The key question is who is going to pay for it. We think it should be those oil and gas companies that have made massive profits they never saw coming, that they don't want, and where they say they have more money than they know what to do with.
With your windfall tax, and this could be £150 billion of spending. It's clear why the markets are spooked by this particular intervention
it's clear
more
they're
than
spooked
anything
because
else.
of the reckless budget, reckless, unnecessary, unfunded tax cuts that this government has decided ought to be a priority, not backing working people, not giving them what they need.
You have not explained that.
It's not the only tax cut, and I think that it's the signal that it sends out.
But the other tax cuts, of course, Labour are supporting, aren't they?
Yeah, but if you add that on top of that, and it's the optics of it as well. If you're yes, governments around the world are borrowing a lot of money to deal with the energy crisis. We get that. Why do you then have to look after the highest earners on top of that?
Can we just go into a counterfactual here? We've got a Labour government. It's just come in. It's said exactly or a similar budget to this, and in the way that the Labour Party is supporting some of these tax cuts, not the 45p tax cut, but it is saying it would do exactly the same. It would say it would do exactly the same energy intervention. I don't see how the markets respond particularly differently to the Labour Party's policies
and that's
as they do to
and that's where we
Conservatives.
come back to. In that sense, Tom does have a point, because we've already set out this week, from Monday to today, all of the things that a Labour government have said if they got into power they would do, much of what has been outlined by Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss. Why would the markets not react in the same way?
We wouldn't be going ahead with that change around corporation tax. We're an outlier on that. We would not be cutting taxes on the wealthiest, and we certainly wouldn't be riding roughshod over understood practice around how we do these things. The OBR were not allowed to publish that full forecast ahead of time that could properly inform these decisions. That's part of the problem that we see, but we would be making a very different set of choices on the economy.
The outlier here would be raising corporation tax in the face of a recession. The corporation tax cut isn't a cut, it's keeping it at the same rate and not raising it as Rishi Sunak wanted to do.
It is not. The government argue that it's to drive growth. We haven't seen
in the world
growth
is raising
over the last 12 years. We have had a big failure on growth from this government. Now they've come in and said, well, we'll cut taxes for the wealthiest and that'll get us every problem sorted. It is ludicrous. The evidence doesn't bear it out.
And there are European countries that are raising taxes or have higher taxes and higher growth, aren't there, Tom?
There are some European countries that have a very different structure.
But on that point, they have higher taxes and higher growth.
But we are focusing entirely on tax when we should be talking more about supply-side reform, which will be the biggest growth part of this growth plan.
What does that mean?
Supply-side reform, well, Take planning, for example, the biggest stunt on our growth in the United Kingdom. It is almost impossible to build a house if you want to build a house. If you can have people objecting to it in an arbitrary way, politics intervening in a way that it intervenes in third world countries, not in first world liberal democracies. Having a more rational planning system would be the biggest boost to growth.
How long would that take, though?
How long would it take to implement a new
years,
planning? Well, I'm sorry, you could just pass a bill that says, if you really wanted to be incredibly
radical... It would take
radical...
time, wouldn't it, though, to shake down? If you're talking about market reaction to supply-side reforms, it would take some time.
So the economic effects to be felt from it as well.
So the biggest thing is market expectation when it comes to supply-side reform. Potentially, one of the reasons why the markets are less stabilised by this is because they don't believe it might be politically possible. Well, one of the biggest things to prove that is to see whether Liz Truss can bear down pressure from politicians and see if she can get through that supply-side reform.
In the meantime, there's been more market reaction. BBC News tweeting out the pound falls further in value against the US dollar, slumping 1.5% to $1.05. It comes after, of course, the Bank of England announced it's going to be buying government bonds to stabilise the market. Not a vote of confidence, then, even with that Bank of England announcement.
No, it's not, and it's interesting looking at what the pound did over the last few days. Of course, it dropped to 1.03 at one point earlier this week, and then it rose on the expectation that the Bank of England would raise interest rates. And that's the crucial other point of this policy. A lot of economists who are sympathetic to Liz Truss have been saying for some time now that the solutions that to the economic malaise in this country are looser fiscal policy and tighter monetary policy. So the Bank of England does need to think about raising rates to try and stabilise that.
Right, I mean, your readers reacting to the prospect of higher interest rates, is that something they're going to welcome?
It's going to be terrifying. As I say, you know, Liverpool is a region with an area with significant deprivation issues already. The cost of living crisis is hitting harder here than many other places. The last thing people need right now, when they're currently trying to get through this most difficult of winters, is to think about their interest rates doubling, trebling next year. I just wanted to pick up something before as well. You talked about other countries that have a higher tax burden and have growth. And the sort of elephant in the room here is they also have good public services, which there's nothing in anything in what the Chancellor said to look. And the thing that's coming down the line, which we probably know, is spending cuts. Where on earth are they going to cut from? Local government's been absolutely cut to the bone, and the NHS is on its knees. So that's something that's kind of terrifying coming down the line. Again, a city like Liverpool, they can't really have any more cuts. They've cut everything away. So I'm very worried about what's to come.
Well, of course, this week has been about Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, presenting himself as the next Prime Minister, and that the Labour Party will be a government in waiting. He was asked this morning, after giving his conference speech yesterday, about the reception he's received and whether or not he's just deemed to be too dull. Let's have a listen to what he said in response on the Today programme earlier today.
When we're facing a period of great uncertainty, we've got conflict in Ukraine, we've got a cost of living crisis, we've got a government that's lost control of the economy. Do we need a serious person steering the country calmly and confidently to a better future? I think the answer to that is yes. Not someone who's... If I came on and said I'd done a bungee jump, you wouldn't say, well, great, now we've got the Prime Minister we need.
Liam Thorpe, your response to that?
You know, I wrote yesterday that I think when you look at the chaos that's happening in the markets, the chaos surrounding the government, it's probably the best time ever to be a bit serious, and if a bit dull, then yes. I think, you know, speaking to people before, they were saying, I'd love it if our politics was a bit boring. It's just so chaotic. It's been like this for years now. So I think it plays into Starmer's hands. He came across yesterday pretty serious, competent. He's not the most energising speaker in the world, but I think he's got better. And I think the mood at this conference, I imagine, compared to what it's going to be like at the Tory conference, couldn't be more different. We're used to saying, you know, Labour conference is surrounded with drama. We've had resignations, attempted coups, all that sort of thing. It's just been fine, and I think that Labour will take that very happily.
Tom?
Yeah, I think the Labour Party's had a good conference, and I think that ultimately there's a clear pitch from Sir Keir Starmer, presentationally at least, even if not always the policy matches the words. But clearly the Labour Party is pitching itself much more towards the centre ground, even if its policy is not, even if they want to have much higher rates of tax than under Tony Blair. They are talking as if they are.
They're renationalising rail?
OK, yes, they're renationalising rail.
They're going to become a green energy company?
They're creating an energy supply company, which isn't quite the same as renationalising energy companies. No. But this is the point. Quoting Tony Blair in a conference speech and saying and talking in the language of fiscal responsibility, but then at the same time promising or saying that you would reverse tax cuts and then do more spending on top of that as if that would pay for it. It might sound a bit complicated, but that's because it's a bit bizarre.
All right. One final question question, Bridget, because you were asked last night on Newsnight about your response, whether you would condemn the comments made by the Labour MP Rupa Huq, who said that Kwasi Kwarteng was superficially black, and that on the radio he didn't even sound like a black man. You condemned them as wrong, and that she should apologise, which she has done, and she lost the whip. Why wouldn't you condemn them as racist comments, which Keir Starmer did this morning?
I do believe they were wrong. I hadn't heard the full audio at that point. I'd heard the selected quotes from it, and I do think it was racist, having listened to the full excerpt.
OK, so that's what changed overnight, is
Yes.
it? And Rupa Huq obviously has apologised.
Yes, and it's right the party's taken action.
All right, let's talk about energy, because yesterday we heard Keir Starmer deliver his keynote conference speech, and in it there was real focus, as there has been all week, on green energy and a pledge to reach zero carbon in electricity production by 2030. We can speak to Xeon Lights, the founder of Emergency Reactor, which campaigns for nuclear power to play an important role in decarbonising the UK economy. She's also a member of the Labour Party. Hello to you, Xeon. What do you make of this pledge by the Labour Party, and will it keep the lights on?
Great British energy. I think it's brilliant. I think I've been waiting to hear a plan like this for decades. I haven't seen such an ambitious plan. Probably we haven't seen this in British history since Clement Attlee's government came up with the idea for the National Health Service. It's music to my ears to hear Sir Keir Starmer talking about homegrown renewables and nuclear. This is what works. This is how large industrial grids around the world are decarbonised. Finally, we're going to have a plan to do it. I think there are a lot of challenges. There are challenges, as someone said earlier, in planning and regulation, but it's not just that. I don't think we can just focus on that and say this is a top-down issue. There is a problem on the ground. In the last year, we had a record number of objections to solar farms being built in Britain, so we need to have a public information campaign, I think, as well. There are a lot of challenges with getting British people on board. You know, a lot of people will say they want clean energy, but then they don't want it in their backyard.
All right, let me just put some more questions to you, because the specific here is it achievable by 2030 without the lights going out?
I think we're already at risk of the lights going out. I think we need a bold plan, and this is a bold plan. There's no reason that we can't build lots of renewables very quickly, nuclear, which will take longer, which, as I understand, the plan recognises that, which would then provide the baseload to get us off of fossil fuels. I think, you know, it is very ambitious. I think it is achievable. I haven't seen the numbers. I haven't seen the way it's been added up. You know, I'm not privy to that information, but it's not unachievable. Other countries have managed to do it. We just haven't really, we've dragged our feet on it, really, and we've had weak ambitions in this area, weak leadership, I would say, for decades.
Right. And what happens when it's not windy or sunny?
Well, that's why you need baseload. You need a baseload, firm, clean, stable power source. That's nuclear energy. If you want a dirty source, you can have fossil fuels. Well, I mean, look, nuclear reactors can be built in 3 years. The average build time is actually 7 years. So Japan builds them in 3 years. You know, other countries have built, Switzerland's built them in 3 years. The reason everything takes so long to build here is we have a shortage of workers. So I was going to say earlier, we have an issue with kind of NIMBYism, people not wanting things to be built. We also have a shortage of workers. People are always, we had this whole campaign, didn't we, about we're going to build Britain, it's going to be amazing. We don't build anything. We have virtually no industry, no manufacturing. It is music to my ears to hear Sir Keir Starmer talk about clean steel, battery factories, gigafactories, in North and South England, creating industry. We need to reindustrialize, because that we are in these crises, and especially an energy crisis, because we've failed on all these counts.
All right, but there is a timing issue, as you say. It will take a number of years. We do have an issue, potentially, if it isn't windy or sunny. And if we can actually generate all that electricity with nuclear, what is the point of investing in wind turbines and solar energy?
Well, I get asked this question a lot, and you'll find people who just want nuclear or just want renewables. It doesn't really matter what my opinion is. I'm going by the United Nations data from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report, which says we need to make sure we have a diversified energy mix, and it says we need nuclear and renewables to decarbonise. That's all I'm saying here. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Basically, look at all the countries, the large industrialised grids that have managed this. France, Sweden, Finland, nowhere has done it. Even Sweden, which has a huge amount of hydropower, still has about 30% nuclear as a base load. You need firm capacity. what I would say is we just need to make sure it's clean. I've heard all this discussion today about cost and economy. No one's once mentioned climate change. There is going to be a huge cost. The cost of the global economy will be trillions if we don't act on climate change. I know there are other crises, but we need to remember that that is also an ongoing crisis. And the energy is a huge factor in that.
Well, let's put it to the rest of our panel. Thank you to you, Xeon Lights, although you're welcome to stay and listen to the discussion. Tom, you heard there the mix. Nuclear might take a few years, 3 years, I think Xeon Lights said.
Well, that would require significant deregulation.
It would, and you've already mentioned that. But what about solar farms and wind farms on land in big style?
Well, we've had an absolutely bizarre situation where it's been functionally illegal to build onshore wind turbines. It took one objection to stop any onshore wind being built, and that's been stopped. The government, interestingly, didn't make a fanfare about this, didn't announce it, but slipped it out that they've removed the ban on onshore wind. That's a very good thing. But similarly, there are so many different little known about restrictions in our planning system to making the energy that we need. For example, a solar farm, if it has planning permission, it actually has a cap on the amount of energy it can produce. If they want to replace those solar panels with higher voltage solar panels, they'd have to get a new set of planning permission. We have bonkers regulation in this country that's really holding back our energy potential.
All right, well, on the bonkers regulation, is this the sort of issue and the sorts of announcements that have been made here in Liverpool at the Labour Party conference what resonates with your readers?
I think so, yes, and particularly Liverpool and the city region has an ambition to be the kind of renewable energy coast. We've already kind of got wind farms where they're looking at creating a tidal project in the River Mersey. I think what Labour have done is they've managed to sort of shift the narrative around the green agenda and make it about growth and about jobs. You know, if we are to build a Mersey tidal barrage in the Mersey, that'll be tens of thousands of jobs locally here, and I think that's what really resonates with people. They want those good jobs for the future. So, you know, that announcement about Great British Energy was probably the most popular thing I heard in the conference.
Well, it's certainly got a very big cheer and a standing ovation. I'll come back to you in just a moment. But actually, does the public really care, Bridget, where their energy is coming from, as long as it's a bit cheaper than it is at the moment?
I think the public does care, and I think this would provide for the energy security that has that impact on prices. We are uniquely exposed as a country because the government hasn't taken those long-term decisions about the energy mix, about gas storage and insulation. You know, so many people live in drafty homes where the bills are higher as a result. We could cut bills if we properly insulated homes. We could cut bills if we had long-term energy security. And the really important part about that is, as well, yes, it drives down bills, but it also creates really brilliant, well-paid, highly skilled jobs, particularly in parts of the country, whether that's Merseyside or in the northeast, where we need to see that we could be at the forefront of driving that technology, really leading the world in it.
What about the issue of insulation? Because there hasn't been a widespread rolling out of an insulation programme by any government in recent times. Is it actually possible to do successfully?
It is possible to do. I mean, as with all of these things, if you've got the will as a government, you can make it happen, because it brings jobs, it cuts bills, it would make a huge difference.
And you want to see more wind farms and solar farms onshore everywhere?
Absolutely. We need a good, proper energy mix, and that involves onshore wind too.
But the thing is that energy is quite expensive right now. There is a huge market signal for companies to build solar farms, wind farms, other forms of generated electricity. What is holding them back isn't that there isn't government investment, it's that they are banned from doing so by the planning system, but also the idea of...
the government hasn't invested, has it? And, I mean,
but when the price of energy is high, that is a market signal for companies to invest. The government is stopping those companies
but the
from
signals that they've sent out...
You do not need a government firm to do that investment.
Liz Truss even said in her election campaign, you know, she wants to see cows and pigs in fields and not solar farms. It was just the completely wrong signal to put out. You know, we do need this mix, and there needs to be government investment. Yes, we need to have regulations that allow these investments to happen, but the government has to get behind it, and it feels like they've just dropped the green agenda altogether at the moment.
Well, they've literally just legalised onshore wind. The green agenda, and they've legislated
that was the message, wasn't it, from Liz Truss? I mean, she didn't actually put out a message that was pro-green in the same way that previous governments
No, but she's putting out a message that is deregulatory, and that means that the market signals are very, very pro-green. There is a very very, very strong case for market environmentalism, and that is something that is a very compelling argument.
We've just got time to show you this. These have been seen on door handles around the conference. Please don't close the door on Europe. Let's talk to Pablo Ohana from the European Movement. You believe that Brexit can't work, despite the efforts of the government, and the Labour Party also say it can work much, much better. In fact, you want a step-by-step approach to rejoin the EU. Listening and looking at those signs, would you like to see a closer relationship, first of all, briefly, Bridget, with Europe?
Yes, we need to fix the Brexit deal. Absolutely, and we do need a closer relationship. The European Union is an important trading partner.
Pamela, is that far enough?
It's not far enough, but it's a good step. Listen, this was a fun stunt to remind the Labour Party that we are here, that we are serious, that there are issues with Brexit that need to be fixed. It doesn't matter whether it's health, housing, security, trade, whatever it is being made worse by Brexit, and this is to remind the Labour Party that we're here. We would have been at the Lib Dems as well. We will be at the Greens, we'll be at the Conservatives. We're completely and strictly cross-party to make sure this debate stays alive.
Right, that's the debate staying alive. But can you try and persuade Bridget that actually Labour Party policy should change and they should be advocating a return to the single market?
It's very, very clear. Listen, we have just had polling back this week. Access to GPs and doctors is harder than ever since Brexit. It doesn't matter where it's housing. All of these issues are made worse by Brexit. And that's okay that the parties are behind the public. Political parties and politicians will always be behind the public. We know that the mood is shifting. We're going to help keep shifting it. And we're going to keep telling parties that they need to shift with us. That's okay, because the European Movement is the only organisation that has the courage to talk about Brexit at the moment. We are locked at the moment in the battle for the soul of this country. This is what Brexit is fundamentally about. It is changing our character. It still risks, Brexit still risks fundamentally and forever changing the character of this country. We are going to fight to stop that. We're going to keep making sure that we put pressure on all the parties, all the politicians. We're doing it constructively. We're not shouting from the outsides. We're in here.
Okay.
We're here to have this conversation with
persuaded?
all parties.
I'm afraid I'm not.
We've got time.
I hear the point, but I voted to remain. I really wanted us to stay in the European Union.
I know.
That didn't happen, and we've left. I think it really is a question of making it work as best we can.
Right.
But how can you make Brexit work? Are we going to say in 3 years' time, oh, we'll make the cost of living crisis work? Brexit hasn't worked. It's not going to work. It isn't working right now. People are losing jobs. Businesses are wrapped. I mean, actually, funny enough, these nearly didn't arrive. They got stuck at the border. We had to travel to Stansted. A member of our staff had to spend 8 hours trying to get them out of Stansted. That's the reality of Brexit.
Bridget?
So it's, I vote to remain, you vote to remain. The reality is it's not working.
Those are some of the kinds of issues that we do see at the border that do need sorting out. Yes, right. I do accept that.
Who's right?
I voted Remain as well, and we're in a very strong Remain city here in Liverpool, a city that has relied on the EU more than many. If you walk around many of the parts of the city centre, you'll see lots of plaques saying this was funded by the European Union.
But is it right for the Labour Party to make Brexit work, or to do what Pablo is saying, which is actually come back into the single market?
I'm frustrated. I'm frustrated by the Labour Party's position, but I also do understand that they don't want the next election to be about Brexit. I think that's what they're doing.
But they're going to the Conservative conference too. I think you've got Michael Heseltine talking to David.
Is he a Liberal Democrat now? It's interesting. I just really want to come back on the investment that the European Union did into the United Kingdom. Of course, for every single year that we were a member of the European Union, the UK was a net contributor to the EU budget. The money that the EU spent in the UK was British taxpayers' money that had been siphoned off and then came back.
Which wasn't happening from the government.
And sure, you can make the argument that British governments are bad and that no party ever elected would make the right decisions for Britain, and that you have to have people in another country making those decisions.
I think a lot of people in Liverpool would feel that way about the funding. If you're losing £500 million to your council and the EU has to step in,
I think a lot of people here at this party conference would say that, for example, in 1997, the Blair government did a lot of investment itself, didn't have to rely on European commissioners to do that, targeted investment, and potentially people closer to where the money is spent can decide better.
Fill the gap of £1 million per hour that Brexit's costing us?
What a functionally ridiculous calculation.
That's government's own figures. That is ONS figures from the government, this government.
Because you cannot possibly work out what the counterfactual is. You don't know how much worse our economy would have been if our vaccine rollout was as slow as Europe's, if we were under the auspices of the European Medicines Agency,
but you do know that, of course,
and we
the
got our
UK
vaccines,
could have opted out and done
right,
their
but
own
why
kind of
didn't
vaccine. Whether they would have done, we won't know.
No European country did. In fact, they
Can
all
I just put
followed that same procurement, and they came out of lockdown later and they lost money.
One of the things where Tom is, of course, correct is that there were parts of the UK that received large amounts of money over a number of years from the EU who voted to leave the European Union.
So, of course, and listen, the referendum was, I worked on the campaign. It was a tough time. We had a really tough campaign. But there are also areas like Northern Ireland which are being battered by Brexit. And there is a real issue with stability and peace in Northern Ireland. I lived there. I moved to Belfast. And my friends who were 18, 19 at the time, all they cared about was moving forward, bringing peace to the country, making sure that people wanted to visit Northern Ireland, that people felt comfortable coming to Belfast. In fact, I moved there, the weekend I moved there, one of my friends said to me, the fact that you have come to Northern Ireland from England shows that we are winning.
Pablo, Hannah, thank you very much for joining. Thank you to all of our guests today for a lively end to the Labour Party conference programmes. Elizabeth Clinker will be back tomorrow with more Politics Live at 12:15 here on BBC Two and on the BBC iPlayer. Bye-bye.